She thought she could humiliate her in front of everyone, but had no idea she was about to insult the woman who owned her entire world. Hello, everyone. Before we dive into today's story, I'd really appreciate your support. Take a quick moment to hit the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any of our upcoming stories. It's completely free and helps us keep bringing you more powerful and emotional content. Also, I'd love to know where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thanks so much for being here. The rooftop of the Langford Grand Tower shimmered under a warm Manhattan night, golden lights reflecting off crystal glasses and polished marble floors as the city stretched endlessly below, a skyline reserved for those who believed they owned the world. And in many ways, they did, or at least they thought they did, dressed in tailored suits and designer gowns worth more than most people's monthly rent. Laughter floated through the air like a currency of status, measured, curated, exclusive. And right at the center of it all stood Victoria Langford, poised, flawless, her silver heels clicking softly against the marble as conversations bent around her presence. Because this was her domain, her event, her carefully constructed kingdom of influence and wealth, a place where every guest had been handpicked, every detail controlled, every face familiar, or at least supposed to be. Which is why the moment Emily Carter stepped out of the elevator, something shifted, subtle at first, like a note out of tune in an otherwise perfect symphony. She didn't belong, not by their standards, not by the silent rules that governed rooms like this. Her jeans were simple, her blouse understated, the kind you could find for less than $20 at any neighborhood store. Her shoes practical, her hair loosely tied back, no diamonds, no labels, no visible signs of status. And yet she walked in without hesitation, her posture calm, her eyes steady, taking in the space not with awe, but with quiet familiarity. And that was what unsettled them the most, because people who didn't belong usually looked lost. But Emily didn't. She moved as if she had every right to be there, which made the whispers start, low at first, then spreading like ripples across the room. Who invited her? Is this some kind of mistake? Glasses paused midair, conversations dipped, and slowly, inevitably, attention shifted toward her, until Victoria noticed, her smile tightening just slightly as her gaze followed the line of curious stares and landed on Emily. And in that instant, judgment formed, quick and absolute. Because in Victoria's world, appearances weren't just impressions, they were evidence, proof of worth, proof of belonging, and Emily, in her simplicity, failed every unspoken test. Victoria took a slow step forward, her expression polished, controlled, but her eyes sharp with quiet disdain as she approached, the room subtly parting to give her space. Because everyone knew what was coming next. These moments were familiar here, the gentle but firm correction of someone who didn't belong, the quiet removal of imperfection from a curated environment. And as Victoria stopped just a few feet away from Emily, her voice smooth but edged with something colder beneath, she said, "I'm sorry, but this is a private event." Her tone polite enough to pass as courtesy, but unmistakably dismissive. And for a brief second, the entire rooftop seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see how this would unfold. Because what Victoria didn't realize, not yet, was that this wasn't just another guest she could dismiss. This wasn't a mistake she could quietly correct. This was the moment everything she thought she controlled was about to slip, and Emily, standing there under the city lights, simply looked at her, calm, unbothered, as if she had been expecting this all along. Emily did not move, did not apologize, did not even glance around for approval the way most people would when placed under that kind of scrutiny. Instead, she held Victoria's gaze with a quiet steadiness that felt almost out of place in a room built on performance. And for a brief second, something flickered in Victoria's expression, not doubt, but irritation, because she was used to immediate compliance, to people shrinking under pressure, to quick apologies and embarrassed exits. But Emily offered none of that. She simply said, in a calm, even tone, "I understand it is private," and her voice carried just enough clarity to cut through the low hum of whispers gathering behind them. "Which is why I am here." The words landed softly, but they did not fit the script Victoria had already written in her mind, and that alone made the tension sharpen. A few guests exchanged glances, some amused, others curious, As if sensing that this moment was not unfolding the way it usually did, Victoria let out a small, controlled breath, her smile tightening again as she adjusted her posture, leaning slightly into authority. "Then perhaps you can tell me who invited you," she said, her tone still polished, but now edged with challenge. And the question was not really a question. It was a test, one Emily was expected to fail publicly, because in this world, access was everything. Names were currency. And without the right one, you were nothing. But Emily did not rush to answer. She glanced briefly across the rooftop, her eyes moving over the chandeliers, the arrangement of tables, the positioning of staff, details most guests ignored, but she seemed to register effortlessly. And then she looked back at Victoria. "I did not need an invitation," she said simply. And that was when the first ripple of laughter broke through the crowd, light at first, then spreading, because to them, it sounded absurd, almost amusing. A woman dressed like her claiming access without invitation in a space like this. Victoria let the laughter linger for a moment, using it, letting it reinforce the invisible hierarchy she controlled, before raising a hand slightly to quiet the room, her eyes never leaving Emily. "Everyone here needed an invitation," she replied, slower now, each word deliberate. "That is how this works." And beneath the elegance of her tone was something firmer, a warning dressed as etiquette. But Emily did not react the way expected. She did not argue, did not defend herself. She simply tilted her head slightly, as if considering something far more practical than social rules. "That may be how it usually works," she said, her voice still calm, almost thoughtful, "but not tonight." And that was when the room shifted again. Because confidence without explanation unsettled people more than arrogance ever could. A man near the bar lowered his glass. Another guest stopped mid-conversation, and even the servers seemed to slow their movements as if sensing the tension building in layers beneath the surface. Victoria's patience thinned just enough to show, her smile fading into something cooler, more precise. "I am going to ask you one more time," she said, stepping slightly closer, closing the distance in a way that asserted control. "Who invited you?" And now the question carried weight, not just social pressure, but authority backed by reputation, the kind that could remove someone from a room without a second thought. And for a moment, everything went quiet, the city noise below fading into the background, the soft music barely noticeable, all attention fixed on Emily, waiting for the break, the apology, the retreat. But instead, Emily gave a small, almost imperceptible smile, not mocking, not defensive, just certain, and she said, "Victoria," her voice gentle but unmistakably clear, "you did." And the words landed in a way no one expected, not loud, not dramatic, but heavy, as if they carried a meaning the room had not yet caught up to. And for the first time, Victoria did not respond immediately, her expression freezing for a fraction of a second, because something about the way Emily said it did not feel like a guess. It felt like a fact. And somewhere behind them, near the entrance, a staff member suddenly straightened, his posture shifting as his eyes locked onto Emily with recognition he did not yet dare to voice. And the room, once filled with controlled laughter and quiet superiority, began to feel something unfamiliar creeping in, uncertainty. The words did not echo loudly, but they lingered in the air with a weight that made the room hesitate, as if reality itself needed a moment to catch up. And Victoria's expression, once perfectly composed, faltered just slightly, her brows tightening as she searched Emily's face for any sign of uncertainty. Any crack that would confirm this was nothing more than an awkward bluff. But Emily stood there unchanged, calm, steady, almost patient, and that was what unsettled her the most, because people who lied usually filled the silence. They over-explained, they stumbled. But Emily did neither. She simply waited, and that silence began to stretch, pulling the attention of everyone closer. The soft clink of glass fading, conversations dissolving into quiet observation, until the rooftop no longer felt like a celebration but a stage where something irreversible was about to unfold. Victoria let out a short breath, a controlled laugh slipping through, the kind meant to dismiss, to restore order. "That is not funny," she said, though her tone lacked the confidence it had carried moments ago, and a few guests joined in with uncertain chuckles. Not because they found it amusing, but because they trusted her certainty more than their own instincts, or at least they had, until now. I think you are confused, Victoria continued, straightening her posture, reclaiming her authority piece by piece. I organized this entire event, she added, emphasizing each word as if repetition alone could anchor reality back in place. And for a moment, it worked. The room seemed to lean back toward her version of truth. But then, from near the entrance, a voice broke through, hesitant at first, "Ma'am," and it was enough to shift the balance again. Heads turned, eyes followed, and the man who stepped forward was not just any staff member. His tailored suit marked him as part of upper management. Someone who did not speak out of turn, someone who understood the weight of interruption in a room like this. His steps were careful, measured, but there was something in his expression, something urgent, something restrained, as if he were walking a line he could not afford to misstep. He stopped just behind Victoria, glancing briefly at her before looking directly at Emily. And in that moment, the recognition in his eyes was no longer subtle. It was clear, undeniable. "Ms. Carter," he said, his voice respectful, controlled, but unmistakably different from the tone anyone had used toward her so far. And the shift was immediate, like a current running through the room, because titles mattered here. Names mattered, and the way he said hers carried meaning. Victoria turned sharply, her composure cracking just enough to reveal the confusion underneath. "What are you doing?" she said quietly. But there was an edge now, a warning, because this was not part of the script, not part of the control she had built. The man hesitated for only a second, but that second stretched, visible to everyone watching, before he spoke again, more carefully this time. "There seems to have been a misunderstanding," he said, choosing each word with precision, but his gaze did not leave Emily, and that alone spoke louder than anything else. Victoria's jaw tightened, her patience thinning into something sharper. "Then clarify it," she said, her voice lower now, controlled but strained, because she could feel it, the shift, the way the room was no longer firmly on her side, the way uncertainty had begun to replace certainty, and uncertainty was dangerous in a place built on perception. The man drew a breath, subtle, but visible, as if steadying himself, and then he said it, not loudly, not dramatically, but clearly enough that every person in the room heard it. "Ms. Carter is the majority stakeholder of Langford Holdings." And for a fraction of a second, nothing happened, no reaction, no sound, just a stillness so complete it felt almost unnatural, as if the entire rooftop had paused in disbelief. And then, like a delayed wave, realization began to ripple outward, slow at first, then faster, expressions changing, posture shifting, conversations that had not yet resumed stopping entirely before they could even begin. And Victoria, standing at the center of it all, felt the ground beneath her certainty shift in a way she had never experienced before, because this was not a misunderstanding she could correct, not a situation she could control. This was something else entirely, something that did not fit within the boundaries she had always relied on. And as she looked at Emily again, really looked this time, the simplicity no longer read as insignificance. It read as something far more unsettling, something intentional, something powerful, and the room, once filled with quiet superiority, fell into a silence that no one dared to break. The silence did not break. It deepened, pressing against every corner of the rooftop as if the air itself had shifted. And for the first time that night, Victoria Langford did not look like the most powerful person in the room. She looked uncertain, her lips parting slightly as if searching for words that refused to come, because everything she understood about control, about hierarchy, about who belonged and who did not, had just been quietly dismantled in a single sentence, and the weight of that realization began to settle in the expressions around her. Guests who had once stood comfortably at her side now subtly stepping back, not dramatically, not openly, but enough to create distance, enough to signal that the ground had changed and they were adjusting with it. Because in rooms like this, alignment followed power, and power had just shifted. Victoria forced a breath, her composure not entirely gone but strained, stretched thin under pressure she had not anticipated. "That is not possible," she said, her voice controlled but no longer effortless, and the words felt less like a statement and more like a refusal, as if denying It might restore the balance she had lost. The man behind her did not respond immediately, and that hesitation only made everything louder, every second stretching, every pair of eyes watching, until he finally spoke again, carefully, respectfully, but with a certainty that did not waver. "It is accurate," he said, and then, after a brief pause that carried more weight than any explanation, "She finalized the acquisition 6 months ago," and the room reacted, not with noise, but with stillness. A deeper, heavier silence that came from understanding. Because acquisitions of that scale were not rumors, they were facts, documented, undeniable, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the perspective of the crowd began to shift. The same people who had laughed minutes ago now looked at Emily differently, not just with surprise, but with something closer to respect, or perhaps caution, because the simplicity they had dismissed now felt intentional, and intention implied control. Victoria's gaze moved back to Emily, searching, reevaluating, and this time she noticed what she had missed before, not the clothes, not the lack of visible status, but the way Emily stood, grounded, unshaken, as if none of this had caught her off guard, as if she had seen this exact reaction countless times before, and that realization unsettled her more than anything else, because it meant this was not an accident. This was not a misunderstanding. This was a pattern, one Emily understood far better than anyone else in that room. Victoria took a step forward, smaller now, less commanding, her voice softer. "If that is true," she began, choosing her words more carefully than before, "then why would you come here like this?" And the question revealed more than she intended, because it exposed the assumption at the core of everything that had just happened, that power should look a certain way, that wealth should present itself visibly, that status should be announced, and Emily, hearing it, did not respond immediately. She let the question sit, let it settle into the silence that still held the room, and then she answered, simply, without edge, without performance, "Because I wanted to see," she said, her voice calm, steady, "how people treat someone when they believe she has nothing." And the words landed with a clarity that cut deeper than any accusation, because they did not attack, they revealed, and in that moment, every person standing there felt it, the quiet mirror being held up to them. The realization of how quickly judgment had formed, how easily it had been expressed. Victoria's expression shifted again, not fully broken, but no longer certain, her confidence replaced with something more complicated, something closer to awareness, and around them. The room remained still, no laughter, no whispers, just a collective understanding settling in. And Emily, standing at the center of it all, did not look triumphant, did not look angry. She simply looked composed, as if this outcome had never been in doubt, as if the only question had been how long it would take for everyone else to catch up. No one spoke, not immediately, because Emily's words had done something far more powerful than confrontation. They had stripped the room of its illusion, and in its place left something raw and undeniable. The truth of how quickly judgment forms when status is not visible, and how fragile that judgment becomes when reality shifts. Victoria stood still, her thoughts catching up to the moment in uneven fragments, replaying every word she had said, every glance she had given, every assumption she had made. And for the first time that night, she became aware of the audience not as supporters, but as witnesses, people who had seen the entire exchange unfold and now understood it differently, not as a correction of a mistake, but as a misstep, and in a room built on perception. That distinction mattered more than anything else. She drew in a slow breath, her voice softer now, stripped of the effortless authority it once carried. "Ms. Carter," she said, and even the use of the name felt like an adjustment, a recognition that could not be undone. "If there has been any misunderstanding," she began, choosing her words carefully, cautiously, "I would like to clarify that it was never my intention to." She paused, the sentence faltering slightly, because intention no longer mattered in a moment defined by action, and she knew it. The room knew it. Emily knew it, and that awareness hung between them, heavy and inescapable. Emily watched her, not with satisfaction, not with judgment, but with a quiet attentiveness that made the apology feel smaller, not because it was insincere, but because it was too late to change what had already been revealed. There was no misunderstanding, Emily said gently, her voice even, composed, and that response, simple as it was, closed the space Victoria had been trying to open. It did not escalate. It did not accuse. It simply acknowledged what had already happened, and in doing so, made it undeniable. Around them, the guests shifted again, but this time it was not subtle. A few people stepped forward slightly, their posture adjusting, their expressions changing, some offering polite nods toward Emily, others lowering their gaze as if reconsidering their place in the moment, because alignment had shifted and they were following it, as they always did. Victoria noticed it too. Of course she did. She had built her influence on understanding these exact dynamics, and now she was experiencing them from the other side. The slow, almost imperceptible withdrawal of support, the quiet repositioning of loyalty. It was not dramatic, but it was unmistakable, and it unsettled her in a way she had never anticipated. She straightened slightly, not to regain control, but to steady herself. "I see," she said, though what she saw was not something she could easily accept. Her gaze moved briefly across the room, taking in the changed expressions, the altered energy, and then returned to Emily, who had not moved, had not shifted, had not needed to, because the room had adjusted around her instead, and that realization settled in with a clarity that could not be ignored. Emily did not need to assert authority. She did not need to demand respect. It arrived on its own the moment people understood who she was, and more importantly, what she represented. And for a brief moment, something unspoken passed between them. Not hostility, not reconciliation, but recognition. The understanding of two people who operated in the same world, but approached it in entirely different ways. Victoria's voice softened further, almost reflective now. "You already knew," she said quietly, not as an accusation, but as a realization, and Emily gave a small nod. Not dramatic, not emphasized, just enough to confirm it. "I had a feeling," she replied, and there was no pride in it, no sense of victory, just a simple acknowledgement of experience, the kind that comes from having seen the same pattern repeat over and over again. And around them, the rooftop remained silent, not because there was nothing to say, but because everyone understood that whatever came next would not be spoken loudly. It would be felt, carried, remembered, and Emily, after a brief pause, glanced once more at the skyline beyond the glass, the city lights stretching endlessly, and then back at Victoria, her expression calm, unwavering. "The interesting thing about power," she said, her voice steady, clear enough for those closest to hear, "is that it reveals people more than it defines them." And as the words settled into the quiet, no one moved, no one interrupted, because in that moment, the lesson had already been delivered, and the room, once filled with certainty, now stood in reflection. The words lingered long after Emily finished speaking, settling into the quiet like a truth no one could easily step away from. And for a moment, no one tried. The rooftop no longer felt like a place of celebration, but a place of realization, where every polished surface reflected something deeper than status. And Victoria stood there absorbing it, not just the words, but the shift they had created, because she could feel it now, the way the room no longer revolved around her, the way attention had realigned without permission, without announcement, simply because reality had changed. And for someone who had built her world on control, that loss of center was impossible to ignore. She looked at Emily again, but this time without assumption, without the automatic judgment that had defined her first impression. And what she saw was not just simplicity, but intention, not just calm, but confidence that did not need validation. And that realization carried weight, because it challenged everything she had relied on. "You could have told me," Victoria said after a moment, her voice quieter now, not defensive, not commanding, just honest in a way it had not been before. And Emily met her gaze without hesitation. "I could have," she replied, her tone steady. "But then nothing would have been real." And that answer settled in deeper than the previous ones, because it exposed the difference between appearance and truth, between how people act when they know versus how they act when they assume. And around them, the guests remained still, listening, not out of obligation, but because they understood they were witnessing something that extended beyond a single moment, something that touched the way they moved through the world itself. A man near the bar lowered his eyes, a woman adjusted her posture as if suddenly aware of how she had stood just minutes earlier, small gestures, but meaningful ones, because awareness had replaced certainty, and certainty once broken rarely returned the same way. Victoria exhaled slowly, the tension in her shoulders easing not because the situation had resolved, but because resistance no longer made sense. She nodded slightly, more to herself than to Emily, as if acknowledging something she could not deny. "I understand," she said, though understanding in this moment was not comfortable. It was humbling, and that humility showed, not in dramatic apology, but in the way her voice no longer tried to control the outcome. Emily observed her quietly, not with judgment, but with a kind of measured patience, as if giving her space to reach that realization on her own. And then, after a brief pause, Emily shifted her attention, not away, but outward, glancing across the rooftop once more, taking in the people, the atmosphere, the subtle changes that had taken place. And when she spoke again, her voice was softer, but it carried just as clearly. "The problem is not wealth," she said, her gaze moving briefly over the guests before returning to Victoria. "It is what people believe wealth allows them to do." And the statement did not accuse, it clarified. And in doing so, it landed with quiet force, because everyone present could recognize themselves somewhere within it, whether in action or in silence. And the room responded not with sound, but with stillness, a shared understanding that needed no confirmation. Victoria lowered her gaze slightly, not in defeat, but in reflection, and for the first time that evening, she did not try to speak immediately. She let the moment sit, let it exist without interruption, and that, in itself, was a change, because earlier she would have filled the space, redirected it, controlled it, but now she allowed it. And that subtle shift did not go unnoticed. Emily nodded once, almost imperceptibly, as if acknowledging the difference, and then she took a small step back, not retreating, but releasing the center of the moment, allowing the room to breathe again. Conversations did not resume right away, but the tension eased, replaced by something quieter, something more aware, and as the city lights continued to glow beyond the glass, unchanged, constant, the people inside stood in a space that no longer felt quite the same. Because something fundamental had shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but permanently, and Emily, standing there in the same simple clothes, looked exactly as she had when she arrived, but the way the world saw her had changed entirely, and in that difference, the truth of the night remained. The room did not return to what it had been. Even as the soft music resumed, and the faint hum of conversation cautiously began to rise again, because something invisible had shifted beneath the surface, something no one could quite undo. And Emily Carter remained at the center of that shift without needing to claim it, without needing to reinforce it. She simply existed within it, steady and composed. While the world around her adjusted, a few guests approached slowly, not with the same casual confidence they had carried earlier, but with a measured politeness, offering brief nods, quiet acknowledgments, subtle attempts to recalibrate their place in relation to her. And Emily responded the same way she had throughout the evening, with calm, with restraint, never encouraging, never rejecting, just present, as if she understood that respect given after revelation carried a different weight than respect given freely. And across the rooftop, Victoria Langford stood slightly apart now, not isolated, but no longer the unquestioned center she had been at the start of the night. Her posture still composed, her expression still controlled, but something in her presence had changed, something quieter, more reflective, as she watched the way the room moved, the way attention had shifted, the way influence no longer followed the same path. And for the first time, she was observing rather than directing, understanding rather than assuming, and that realization did not come with resistance anymore. It came with clarity. She turned her gaze back toward Emily, studying her not as an interruption, not as a challenge, but as a perspective she had not considered before. And after a moment, she stepped forward again, not with authority, but with intention, closing the distance in a way that felt different this time, more equal, more aware. "You changed the entire room without raising your voice," Victoria said quietly, not as a question, but as an observation, and Emily met her gaze with the same steady calm. "No," she replied gently. "I did not change anything." She paused briefly, letting the words settle. I just allowed everyone to reveal themselves. And the statement landed with quiet precision, because it shifted responsibility away from her and placed it exactly where it belonged, on the choices each person had made. And Victoria nodded slowly, absorbing it, not defensively, but thoughtfully, because for the first time, she was not trying to maintain control of the narrative. She was trying to understand it. That is not something most people would do, she admitted, her voice softer now, carrying a sincerity that had not been present earlier, and Emily's expression did not change, but there was a subtle warmth in her eyes, not approval, not validation, just recognition. Most people are not interested in truth, Emily said calmly. They are interested in comfort. And the words, though simple, carried a weight that resonated far beyond the moment, because they explained not just what had happened, but why it had happened so easily, why assumptions had formed so quickly, why they had been expressed without hesitation. And around them, the rooftop continued to shift back into motion, but the tone had changed, conversations quieter, laughter softer, interactions more deliberate, as if everyone present had become just a little more aware of how they were being seen, and how they were seeing others. Victoria glanced briefly at the skyline beyond the glass, the city stretching endlessly under the night sky, and then back at Emily. I spent years building influence in rooms like this, she said, almost to herself. And tonight it took you minutes to redefine it. And there was no bitterness in her voice, only realization, and Emily shook her head slightly. Influence is not what people think, she replied, her tone steady. It is not about being seen. It is about being understood. And as the words settled, Victoria exhaled slowly, as if releasing something she had carried for longer than she realized. And in that moment, the dynamic between them no longer felt like opposition. It felt like contrast, too. Ways of moving through the same world, one built on visibility, the other on substance, and neither needed to dominate the other for the truth to exist. The rooftop lights continued to glow, the city unchanged, but within that space, something had quietly transformed, not loudly, not dramatically, but deeply. And as Emily stood there, unchanged in appearance yet completely redefined in perception, it became clear to everyone watching that the most powerful presence in the room had never been the one demanding attention. It had been the one that never needed to. The night did not return to its original rhythm. Even as the music grew slightly louder and conversations carefully stitched themselves back together, because something had been exposed that could not be unseen, and the people who once moved with effortless certainty now carried a subtle hesitation in their gestures, in their tone, in the way they approached one another. And at the center of it all, Emily Carter remained unchanged, not elevated by the moment, not diminished by it, simply consistent, and that consistency itself became the most powerful contrast in the room. A few guests now stood closer than before, their expressions measured, respectful, some attempting quiet conversation with her, others simply observing from a distance, as if trying to understand how someone could hold such influence without ever demanding attention. And Emily responded the same way she always had, with calm, with clarity, never overextending, never performing, just present in a way that did not require validation. And across the rooftop, Victoria Langford watched it all unfold with a perspective she had not possessed just an hour earlier. She saw the shifts more clearly now, the way people recalibrated around perceived power, the way tone changed, the way distance formed and dissolved. And for the first time, she was not orchestrating it. She was learning from it. Her gaze lingered on Emily for a moment longer before she moved again, this time not toward the center, but toward the edge of the rooftop where the city lights stretched endlessly below. And for a brief moment, she allowed herself to stand there without speaking, without directing, simply observing. And that pause, though quiet, marked a change that did not need to be announced, because growth rarely does. After a few seconds, she turned back and walked toward Emily once more, her step steady, but no longer driven by control, instead guided by something more deliberate, more thoughtful. I built my reputation on knowing how people behave in rooms like this, Victoria said quietly when she reached her, her voice calm, reflective. And tonight I realized I only understood half of it. And the admission, though subtle, carried weight. because it was not easy for someone in her position to acknowledge limitation, but she did, and Emily listened without interruption, her expression composed, her attention fully present. "There is always another half," Emily replied gently. "The part that only shows when people believe no one is watching." And that statement settled into the space between them with quiet clarity, because it explained not just what had happened, but why it mattered, why it lingered, why it could not be dismissed as a simple misunderstanding. Victoria nodded slowly, absorbing it, not resisting, not deflecting, but accepting, and in that acceptance, something within her shifted further, something deeper than surface perception, something closer to awareness, and around them. The rooftop continued to evolve, the energy softer now, less performative, more grounded. Conversations that resumed did so with a different tone. Laughter that returned was quieter, less sharp, as if everyone present had recalibrated not just their behavior, but their understanding, and Emily, noticing it, did not claim it, did not comment on it. She simply acknowledged it with a brief glance, a subtle awareness that spoke louder than any declaration, because true influence does not need recognition. It manifests in change, and as the night continued, the contrast between what the room had been and what it had become remained undeniable, not because of anything dramatic, but because of something far more lasting, a shift in perception that would follow each person long after they left. Victoria looked once more at Emily, her expression no longer guarded, no longer defensive, but clear, thoughtful, and for the first time, genuinely respectful. "I will remember this," she said quietly, not as a promise to Emily, but as a commitment to herself, and Emily met her gaze with the same calm steadiness that had defined her from the beginning, offering a small nod, not as approval, not as validation, but as acknowledgement. And in that simple exchange, the night reached a kind of quiet resolution, not one defined by victory or defeat, but by understanding. And as the city lights continued to glow beyond the glass, unchanged and constant, the people inside carried with them something that had shifted permanently, something that would shape the way they saw the next person who walked into a room without announcing who they were. Because sometimes, the most powerful lesson is not delivered through force, but through revelation, and once revealed, it cannot be forgotten. The night slowly carried on, but nothing about it felt the same anymore, because while the music played and the skyline shimmered beyond the glass, something deeper had settled into every person standing on that rooftop, something quiet but undeniable. And as conversations resumed and laughter carefully returned, it no longer held the same sharp edge it once did. It was softer now, more aware, as if each person had become just a little more conscious of the space they occupied and the people within it. And Emily Carter, standing exactly as she had from the moment she arrived, remained untouched by the shift she had created, not because she was distant, but because she had never needed the room to validate her presence in the first place. She simply existed within her own certainty, and that certainty had quietly redefined everything around her. After a few more moments, Emily glanced once more across the rooftop, her eyes moving over the guests, the lights, the carefully arranged details that had once symbolized control and exclusivity, and now felt like something else entirely, something more neutral, more human. And without drawing attention to herself, she took a small step toward the exit, not abruptly, not dramatically, just naturally, as if her time there had reached its conclusion. A few nearby guests noticed, their conversations pausing as they watched her move, not out of curiosity anymore, but out of recognition, and one by one, subtle gestures followed. Nods, quiet acknowledgments, a silent respect that required no words. And Victoria Langford saw it too, standing a few feet away, her posture steady, her expression calm but thoughtful. She did not try to stop Emily, did not attempt to reclaim the moment or redirect it. Instead, she simply watched, understanding now that some moments are not meant to be controlled, they are meant to be learned from. And as Emily approached the elevator, Victoria spoke, not loudly, not to command the room, but just enough for Emily to hear. "Thank you," she said, and the words were simple, but they carried a meaning far deeper than politeness. They acknowledged the lesson, the shift, the truth that had been revealed, and Emily paused briefly, turning back just enough to meet her gaze, her expression unchanged, calm, grounded, and she gave a small nod, not as acceptance, not as dismissal, but as recognition, because the moment no longer belonged to either of them alone, it belonged to everyone who had witnessed it. And then, without another word, she stepped into the elevator, the doors closing quietly behind her, leaving the rooftop in a stillness that lingered even after she was gone. And as the elevator descended, the room above did not return to what it had been. It could not, because once perception changes, it does not reverse, it evolves, and the people who remained carried that evolution with them. In the way they spoke, in the way they looked at one another, in the way they would look at the next person who walked into a room without announcing who they were. And Victoria, standing at the center of a space that no longer revolved around her, did not try to reclaim it. Instead, she allowed the silence to settle, allowed the lesson to remain. Because for the first time, she understood that true influence is not about controlling how others see you. It is about understanding how you see others. And that understanding, once gained, cannot be undone. The city lights outside continued to glow, steady and indifferent, as they always had. But inside that rooftop, something had shifted permanently, something quiet, something lasting, something that would follow each person long after the night ended. Because respect is not demanded, it is revealed, and sometimes it reveals more about us than we are ready to see. Respect often reveals itself when you least expect it. If you enjoy stories that uncover truth, dignity, and hidden strength, do not forget to like and subscribe. The next story might just change the way you see the world. Thank you so much for watching.